It was impossible not to notice. The silence between us had become deafening. For weeks, my husband and I had turned into strangers within our own home. The conversations that once flowed naturally had transformed into a series of empty glances, a quick nod, and a forced smile. At first, I thought it was just a phase, maybe a workload overload or simple stress from work, but soon I found myself trying to understand what was happening, without answers, without the courage to ask. I watched him, waiting for something from him, but nothing came. Love, passion, even friendship seemed to have vanished. I felt an unbearable pain as I saw the man I married drifting away from me, as if I no longer mattered. I began questioning myself, my appearance, my attitude, wondering what I had done wrong. But the most painful part was knowing that he too was silent, as if hiding from something he didn't want to share. The coldness in his eyes seemed to grow every day. I felt my soul freeze each time he touched me, and the words were almost non-existent. What happened to us? What happened to the man who used to look at me as if I was everything to him? I couldn't understand, but something deep inside me told me I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And then, after 4 weeks, he finally spoke. Something that changed everything. Something that turned my whole world upside down. If you've ever been through moments like this, where silence speaks louder than words, perhaps this story will resonate deeply with you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because what's coming next will touch your heart in ways you don't expect. I never imagined a silence could be so painful. For weeks, I lived with the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know what. That growing distance between us, that coldness in the air, consumed me inside. I was lost, trying to find an explanation in everything around me. Sometimes, I found myself staring at him, trying to read his eyes, searching for a clue, something that would help me understand what was happening. But nothing came. No words, no gestures, no touch. He was there, but at the same time, he wasn't. His absence was far more present than his physical presence. The pain I felt in my chest was immense, a mix of fear and loneliness. I felt like he no longer loved me, like the man I knew had disappeared. But what hurt the most was not knowing the reason. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know if I had done something wrong, if it was something in me that was pushing him away. He never said anything, never opened up. The silence was like a wall between us. It was on a cold night, when I least expected it, that he finally spoke. I was sitting in the living room, my eyes fixed on the television, but not really watching anything. My body was there, but my mind wandered in a sea of uncertainties. That's when he broke the silence. He sat down beside me, and before I could say anything, he started. His words took me by surprise, shocked me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He confessed that the reason he had been distant and cold was because he had lost his libido. I sat in silence, trying to process what he had just said. I couldn't react immediately. He continued, explaining that he was afraid of disappointing me in bed, of not being the man I expected him to be. He told me that he never wanted to hurt me, but he feared that by not meeting my expectations, he would drive me further away. I stood there, speechless, trying to absorb everything he had just said. His words kept echoing in my mind, one after the other, relentlessly. I was overwhelmed by a wave of conflicting emotions. I felt relief because I finally knew what was going on, but at the same time, a deep sadness took over me. The pain of uncertainty was replaced by a more defined, more real pain, but also one that was harder to bear. I didn't know what to do, how to react. I sat in silence for a few minutes, trying to take it all in. His words still lingered in the air, as if his confession was something I would never fully understand. How could he have kept this to himself for so long? Why didn't he tell me sooner? I looked at him and saw the suffering in his eyes, but anger, frustration, and fear were there too. He was as vulnerable as I was. Maybe even more. I felt distant from him, but at the same time, closer than ever. He was being honest with me, finally opening up about something that had been tormenting him.
But what about me?
Was I ready to deal with this? I didn't know. I never imagined the man I loved was going through something so deep and intimate. And for a moment, I felt guilty, like I had failed to see his pain, failed to see what he had been hiding. But at the same time, there was something inside me telling me that this wasn't the end. It was a chance to start over, to really understand him and myself. Maybe, together, we could overcome this. Life is not always easy, and love is not always perfect. But at that moment, I realized that his vulnerability didn't make me love him less. On the contrary, it made me love him even more. I know it must be hard for you to understand, just like it was for me. The pain of feeling not enough, of feeling like you're losing control of something so important. If it were you, what would you do? How would you deal with this situation? I didn't have answers, but I knew that the truth was there, in front of me. And now, all I wanted was to figure out what to do with it. For the first time, after he confessed everything, I felt a strange weight lift off my chest. I wasn't sure if it was relief, or just the realization that I was no longer in the dark. Either way, his words had opened a door, and yet, standing in that doorway, I felt more lost than ever. How could something so intimate, so deeply personal, suddenly change the entire dynamic of our relationship? For days, I walked around the house like a stranger, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to act. There were moments when I wanted to cry, when the sadness and frustration seemed too much to bear. But I knew that crying wouldn't change anything. What hurt the most was knowing that, for all this time, he had suffered silently, bearing a burden I had no idea existed. In a way, it made me feel selfish. How could I have been so consumed by my own pain, my own loneliness, and not once stop to ask him what he was going through? How could I have missed the signs? I thought I was being patient, understanding, but in reality, I was just waiting for him to fix what was wrong, without realizing that he was waiting for me to understand that the problem was not something that could be easily fixed. It wasn't just about us, about the lack of intimacy, the distance between us. It was about him, about his own insecurities, his own self-doubt. And as much as I wanted to reach out and reassure him, I couldn't help but feel that, somehow, I had been left out of the conversation until now. I had always thought that love was about communication, about sharing everything, no matter how difficult. But what do you do when the person you love keeps their most vulnerable truth hidden? What do you do when that silence has lasted so long that it becomes a wall between you? For days, I grappled with these questions. I tried to understand him, tried to put myself in his shoes, but I couldn't help but wonder if we were too far gone. If the silence between us had already done irreparable damage. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I was here for him, but a part of me couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. Why hadn't he opened up sooner? Why had he allowed me to believe that I was the one at fault? It wasn't just about the lack of intimacy. It was about the emotional distance that had built up over time, the way we had drifted apart without even realizing it. We had both been so wrapped up in our own struggles, so consumed by our own fears, that we hadn't noticed the damage we were doing to each other. But now, everything was different. Now that I knew the truth, I was faced with the harsh reality that there was no quick fix. There was no magic solution that would suddenly make everything better. No matter how much I wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they were, I knew deep down that they couldn't. We had changed. I had changed. And even though part of me wanted to blame him for not speaking up sooner, another part of me understood why he kept it to himself. The fear of disappointing me, of feeling inadequate, those were emotions I could never truly understand until now. How could he have trusted me with something so fragile, so deeply personal? How could he have believed that I would still love him the same way? There was a part of me that felt guilty. Guilty for not noticing sooner. Guilty for not seeing his pain. And yet, there was another part of me that was angry. Angry that we had allowed ourselves to reach this point. Angry that silence had become a comfort zone for both of us, even though it was slowly suffocating everything we had built together. I couldn't blame him. Not entirely. After all, I had my own role to play in this. I had let the silence grow, had let the distance between us become a chasm that neither of us knew how to cross. But now it was different. Now I had the truth. And even though the truth was painful, even though it forced me to confront my own fears and insecurities, it was a starting point. It was a place to begin again. As I sat there, reflecting on everything he had told me, I realized that we couldn't keep pretending. We couldn't keep avoiding the hard conversations. We had to face everything. The fears, the disappointments, the insecurities. But it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. There was no quick fix, no magical solution that could erase the damage that had been done. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it wasn't a complete solution, but it was something. It was the beginning of something new. We had a long road ahead of us, but I was ready to take the first step. I couldn't shake the feeling of rejection that had settled deep in my chest. It wasn't just the lack of intimacy, the absence of physical connection. It was the emotional distance, the sense that he had been slipping away from me for so long, and I hadn't even noticed. His confession had lifted the veil on his pain, but now I was left grappling with my own. I kept asking myself, why did I feel rejected by him? Wasn't this supposed to be something that brought us closer? But instead, I felt the gap between us widening even more. The truth that he had lost his libido because of his fears, his insecurities, should have made me feel compassion for him. And yet, all I could feel was a profound sense of loss. A loss of what we had been, of what I had believed we still were. I wanted to be the understanding wife, the one who would hold his hand and reassure him that everything would be fine, that we would get through this together. But every time I looked at him, all I could see was my own hurt. The pain of feeling like I wasn't enough. That I couldn't be the one to make him feel desired, to reignite the spark between us. Was that really true? Was I really incapable of making him feel loved, wanted, and needed? Those questions haunted me day and night, and no matter how hard I tried to push them aside, they always came back. And that's when the guilt set in. I should have been more supportive, more understanding. But instead, I was so caught up in my own emotional turmoil that I didn't see his. I hadn't seen that he wasn't rejecting me because of something I had done, but because of something he was struggling with internally. The thought that I had been so focused on myself, so lost in my own pain, that I hadn't even noticed his suffering, filled me with shame. How could I have missed it? How could I have been so blind to what was right in front of me? I had always prided myself on being in tune with him, on knowing when something was wrong. But this was different. His silence had been so complete, so impenetrable, that I couldn't even begin to fathom the depth of his struggle. It wasn't just about the lack of physical desire. It was about his fear of failing me, of not being enough. And when I understood that, something inside me shifted. The rejection I felt began to fade, replaced by something else, something softer, more fragile. I felt a deep sense of empathy for him. His vulnerability, his fear, it all made sense now. It wasn't about me. It was about him and the battle he had been fighting within himself. And yet, as much as I wanted to understand, there was still a part of me that felt inadequate. The part of me that couldn't help but feel like I had failed somehow. I had failed to notice the signs. I had failed to ask the right questions. I had failed to see that my husband, the man I had married, was struggling, and that he needed me, not just as his wife, but as his partner, as someone he could turn to when the world felt too heavy. But how could I have been there for him when I didn't even know what he was going through? How could I have known what he needed when he didn't share it with me? I didn't know. And that uncertainty, that lack of clarity, left me feeling lost. We were in uncharted waters now, navigating a space between us that was filled with questions and doubts. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, but I wasn't sure how. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to make everything okay again. The thought that we might never be the same again, that the connection we had once shared might be irreparably broken, filled me with fear. What if we couldn't come back from this? What if this was the beginning of the end? I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that everything we had built together could fall apart so easily. But a part of me couldn't help but wonder if this was something we could truly fix. Or if we were both just too far gone, too broken in our own ways to ever truly heal. I knew that I couldn't change the past, that I couldn't undo the silence, the missed opportunities, the years of not being truly present with each other. But maybe, just maybe, we could start over. Maybe, with time, we could rebuild what had been lost. I wasn't sure how. I wasn't sure when. But as I looked at him, I knew that we had to try. We had to take the first step, even if it was just one small step, and see where it led. Maybe, in the end, that would be enough. I had to admit that everything felt different now. The silence that had been so heavy in our home was still there, but now it had shifted. It was no longer filled with unspoken resentment or confusion. It was now filled with understanding, but that didn't mean it was any easier to navigate. We had cracked open the door to our truths, but the fear of what lay beyond still lingered in the air. It felt like we were standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether we would fall or find a way to climb back up. I wanted to believe that we could fix everything, that we could return to the way things had been, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was no going back. We were both changed, and that was something we had to accept. It was painful, but it was also a beginning. I wanted to make things better, to bring us closer, but how do you rebuild something when both parties have been so deeply affected by the cracks that had formed in the foundation? We had reached a point where we couldn't ignore the damage any longer, and that was both liberating and terrifying. I didn't know how to reach him or how to let him reach me. I knew we needed to talk, to lay everything out on the table, but every time I tried to start a conversation, the words felt hollow, like they didn't carry the weight they once did. I wanted to ask him how he was feeling, how he was coping with everything, but I was afraid that if I did, it would only remind him of the burden he was carrying. I didn't want to make him feel like he had to take care of me, too. He had enough to deal with already. But I couldn't deny the gnawing sense of emptiness I felt. It was like we were in a constant state of waiting for the right words, waiting for the right moment, waiting for something to change. And nothing did. He had opened up to me, and I had tried to understand, but it still felt like there was a wall between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both afraid to fully confront the truth of what had been happening, afraid that if we dug too deep, we might never come back from it. We were stuck, suspended in this strange limbo, and it was suffocating. I didn't want to live like this anymore. I didn't want to feel like we were just two people passing through life together, rather than truly living it. But how could I change that? How could I get us out of this holding pattern? That's when I realized something. I was waiting for him to fix it. I was waiting for him to come to me and tell me everything was going to be okay, that we could get through this, that we could find a way back to each other. But why was I waiting for him? Why wasn't I taking the first step? Was I afraid of what I might find if I did? The answer was yes. I was scared. I was terrified that if I opened up too much, if I let myself be vulnerable, I would lose him completely. I didn't know how much more of this emotional distance I could handle. And yet, I realized that we couldn't keep waiting for the other person to make the first move. If we were ever going to move forward, we both had to be willing to take risks, to be brave enough to face the discomfort and the fear of what was unknown. But how do you take that first step when it feels like everything around you is crumbling? How do you put yourself out there when you're not sure if the other person is even willing to try? For days, I wrestled with these questions, with the desire to break free from this cycle of waiting. I knew that if I didn't do something soon, we would fall into a pattern of avoidance that would slowly erode whatever was left of us. I couldn't let that happen. I had to find a way to reach him, to tell him that I was ready to fight for us, to fight for our love. I had to show him that even though everything had changed, there was still hope. But as much as I wanted to say those words, as much as I wanted to reach out and bridge the gap between us, I wasn't sure I had the strength to do it. What if he wasn't ready? What if he wasn't willing to try? What if, despite everything, we couldn't find our way back to each other? The uncertainty was overwhelming. The fear of rejection, of failure, made my chest tighten with every breath I took. But I knew one thing: I couldn't keep living in this limbo. We both had to take a chance. And in that moment, I realized that the only way we could move forward was if we both embraced the unknown, the uncomfortable, the vulnerable parts of ourselves. Only then could we rebuild what had been broken. So I decided to act. I would talk to him. I would let him know that I was ready to try again, to fight for us. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. but it would be real. And in the end, that's all I wanted, something real. The decision to finally speak was harder than I could have imagined. For days, I walked around in a haze, torn between the need to reach out and the fear of what might happen if I did. Every part of me wanted to talk, to let him know that I was still here, still willing to fight for us. But the silence between us had grown so thick, so heavy, that even the simplest words felt like they would shatter everything. It was as if we had both forgotten how to speak to each other, how to share our feelings without the weight of past misunderstandings hanging over us. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage, unsure of how to bridge the distance that had formed between us. But I knew that if we didn't speak now, we might never have the chance to. So, I decided to take a deep breath and finally let the words spill out. The evening felt colder than usual as I sat across from him in the dim light of the living room. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to gather the courage to say what I had been thinking for weeks. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in what felt like forever. His eyes, once full of warmth and affection, now seemed distant, clouded by his own fears and doubts. I could see the weight of everything he had been carrying, the burden of not being able to share his struggles with me. And I realized, for the first time, that I wasn't the only one who had been suffering. It had never been just about the lack of intimacy, the distance between us. It was about both of us, about our individual fears and insecurities that we had let fester in the silence. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I placed it on top of his. It felt strange, almost foreign, to touch him again after so many weeks of emotional detachment. But when he looked at me, I saw something shift in his eyes, something like hope, or maybe it was just the recognition that we had finally broken through the wall that had kept us apart for so long. "I've been waiting for you to say something," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "I didn't know how to say it," he replied softly. His voice was raw, and I could hear the emotion behind it. He was trying so hard to open up, to show me the man I had once known, the man I had fallen in love with. "I thought you didn't want me anymore," he continued, his words filled with regret. "I thought I wasn't enough for you. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to make you feel what I used to." The pain in his voice struck me like a physical blow. I had never realized how deep his fear of failure had run, how much he had internalized the idea that he wasn't good enough for me. I had always assumed that he knew how much I loved him, how much I wanted him, despite everything that had changed. But now I saw that I had failed to show him that. I had been so focused on my own pain, my own feelings of rejection, that I hadn't stopped to think about how he was feeling. "You are enough," I whispered back, my voice steady now, though my heart was racing. "You're more than enough." The words felt like they had been trapped inside me for so long, and now that they were out, it felt like a weight had been lifted. His eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of the man I had once known, the man who had loved me with everything he had. It wasn't about fixing everything in one conversation, or even in one moment. It was about starting over, about rebuilding the intimacy that had been lost. We had both spent so much time focusing on the things that had gone wrong that we had forgotten to see what was still right between us. We had forgotten to nurture the emotional connection that had always been the foundation of our love. And now, for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we couldn't go back to who we were before, but we could start something new, something real, something that acknowledged the pain we had been through, but also recognized the love that still existed between us. As we sat there, hand in hand, I realized that intimacy wasn't just about physical closeness. It was about vulnerability, about being able to share our fears and desires, about being willing to see each other for who we really were. And that was something I was ready to do. I was ready to be open with him, to let him see me for who I truly was, and to allow him to do the same. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect, but I knew that, together, we could rebuild what had been broken.
And that was enough for me.
The road ahead would be long, and there would be moments of doubt, of fear, but I was ready to take that journey with him. Because in the end, love wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, about learning to accept each other's flaws and finding strength in the vulnerability that came with them. And I was ready to embrace that, with him by my side. It's strange how things can change so quickly. How one moment, everything feels lost, and the next, a new path opens up before you. After everything we had been through, after the silence, the fear, the pain, it felt like we were finally stepping into something new. We had both been through so much, but in that moment, as I looked at him, I realized that we had both been broken in our own ways. And yet, we were still here.
Still willing to try.
Still holding on to the hope that something beautiful could rise from the ashes. I wasn't sure where this would lead us or what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we had a chance. A real chance. We had both made mistakes, both let fear and insecurity drive a wedge between us, but now, we were finally confronting those things together. We were being vulnerable with each other in a way we had never been before, and it felt like the foundation we had once built was beginning to take shape again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. Every step we took felt like we were navigating unfamiliar ground, unsure of where we would end up. But with every small moment of connection, with every word of understanding, we were rebuilding. Rebuilding trust. Rebuilding intimacy. Rebuilding love. And even though it wasn't perfect, even though there would be days when we still felt lost or uncertain, I knew that we were moving forward.
Together.
The silence that had once felt so suffocating now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the sounds of us talking, really talking, about our fears, our hopes, our dreams. We weren't hiding anymore. We were facing everything together, and that made all the difference. I wanted to believe that we would make it, that we would come out of this stronger than ever. But I also knew that nothing was guaranteed. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, of testing even the strongest bonds. But we had something now that we didn't have before, a willingness to face the difficult truths, to be vulnerable, to be real. That was a strength in itself. We had learned to see each other, really see each other, for who we were, not who we wanted to be or who we thought the other person needed us to be. And that, I realized, was the foundation of a love that could endure. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I knew there would be setbacks, moments when we felt like we were losing our way again. But we had taken the first step, and that was all we needed. One step at a time, we would keep moving forward, together. As I looked at him, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Gratitude for the chance to try again, to rebuild, to heal. Gratitude for his honesty, for his willingness to be vulnerable with me, for his love. We weren't perfect, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was in our imperfections that we would find our strength. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about being real. And that was something I could hold on to. That was something I could believe in. As I held his hand, I knew that the journey ahead would be long, but it would be worth it. It would be worth it because we were doing it together. And that was all I needed to know. If you've been moved by this story, if you've ever been through a similar struggle or have your own story of rebuilding love, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be told, need to be heard. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive, helping others who may be walking a similar path. I also invite you to share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments. Let's create a space where we can support each other, share our truths, and honor the journeys we've all been on. The memories we preserve, the voices we give, matter. They remind us that we're not alone. And for more heartfelt stories like this, make sure to check out our playlist. The link is in the description or in the pinned comment. Let's continue to explore these powerful, emotional stories together.